All right. Hello and welcome everyone here to this meeting. Just to let you know, per TCC's policy, this meeting is being recorded and there is a transcription going as well. So if you do not care to be on a recording or anything with a transcription, please turn off your camera and mute yourself, and you do not have to participate in the chat. For everyone who's here today, hello and welcome. We are very, very excited that so many of you took time out of your day to come and attend this very important event. Today marks the 40th anniversary of the Challenger disaster, and today we're going to hear different perspectives about this event from two really dynamic professors here at TCC. I am Dr. Chloe Northrup. I am the Connect History Department Chair, and I am here today to act as host and moderator for our two wonderful speakers. And this is really great because we do a lot of events at Connect, and it's really exciting that we have a Connect professor here today and a professor from our sister campus, the Northeast campus. So the two speakers today are Misty Wilson Mertens, who is one of the original faculty members of TCC Connect campus. Misty is an associate professor of history and government. A former TCC student, she received her BA at UTA and did her graduate work at Texas Christian University and Sam Houston State University. She currently serves as the contact advisor for the Connect PTK chapter, Beta Chi Zeta. And then our second speaker today is Raymond Benj from the Northeast campus, who is an associate professor of astronomy and physics at TCC. He is a native Texan, born in Houston, and grew up during the height of the Apollo missions to the moon, giving him a lifelong interest in space. After getting a BS in physics from Duke University, he came back to Texas for his graduate degree at Texas A&M. He did an undergrad internship in molecular biophysics, a master's degree in cryophysics, and returned to his passion of astronomy. His research interests include interacting binary stars. He's also published a number of papers and encyclopedia articles on the history of science and space exploration. He and Misty both hold the Chancellor's Award in teaching here at TCC, showing the excellence that we have here at TCC and also how lucky we are to get to learn from these two really dynamic speakers. Misty is going to start, and then Ray will keep it going today. Please put any questions you have in the chat, and we will definitely get to them hopefully at the end of this session. Thank you for joining us here today. I hope everyone is staying warm and safe.
Thank you, Dr. Northrup. So I'm going to start first by thanking Dr. Snaples. I don't know if he's here with us today, but he did a lot of original research out at NASA, and he was kind enough to send me some of that and send me some oral histories he did so that you guys are getting a real inside peek here of what was going on during this time period at NASA. And I also want to shout out Lisa Blank, who is a history professor at the Trinity River campus, because she also is going to show up here in a minute, a little cameo for this. All right, so when we're talking about Challenger, we really need to go all the way back to the 1950s to talk about the Cold War and how we need to put this in historical context of what was going on between the United States and the Soviet Union. The United States believed that we were scientifically ahead of the Soviet Union in many areas, including atomic bombs and the space race. And then we find out we are not as ahead as we thought we were. So in October of 1957, the first man entered space, and this was a Soviet man. He launches on Sputnik, and this catches the United States by surprise, and our government is a little bit embarrassed. We thought we were ahead. So them getting to space first really throws that out of our perception. So in 1958, President Eisenhower is going to sign the National Aeronautics and Space Act, which creates NASA. This is going to give NASA a mission to not just militarily advance into space, but to advance our scientific, engineering, IT, human resources. All of these efforts are going to be put into getting us into the lead of the space race. The mission is scientific discovery, but also to boost our national pride. You cannot divorce this from the Cold War. We are in a race here. We want to beat the Soviets. And so everything we're doing is not just scientific, it's also a point of pride. We want to make sure that the Americans are the first. You guys know this. When we get to the moon, what's the first thing we do? We put our flag on it, right? We won. In October of 58, NASA officially starts, and we are going to see a staff of about 8,000 and a budget of 340 million. If we convert that to money today, that's almost $4 billion. So that is a huge budget early on. In 1961, we are going to see NASA first pilot the Freedom 7 Mercury capsule. Alan Shepard is going to take a 15-minute suborbital flight, and there's no communication glitches. Everything goes about as well as it possibly could. And we are now ahead in the space race. We're back in this. So in 62, at Rice University in Houston, President Kennedy is going to give a speech. This is one of his most famous speeches. It's titled, "We Chose to Go to the Moon." I'm not going to read you guys the whole speech, I promise. But I do want to read you this little quote here because it's so important. "We chose to go to the moon in this decade and do other things, not because they're easy, but because they are hard. Because that goal will serve to organize and measure the best of our energies and skills. That challenge is one that we willingly accept. We are unwilling to postpone, and we are intended to win." This challenge he gives the nation in the speech is that he wants us to get to the moon by the end of the decade. If you look at our national spending at this point, by 1966, we are spending about 4% of our government's money on NASA. I know 4% sounds low, but to spend 4% on any one thing is actually very, very high. So we are going to think that we're going to do this. We're going to get to the moon. We're going to put our flag on it. We are going to win. What's really interesting to me, though, about this is that in hindsight, we think that this is something that's uniting us, that we all agree on. And it's not necessarily the case. If you go and look at Gallup polls from the time, what we actually see is that there's not a majority of approval from Americans about this program. The reason Americans aren't super supportive is because of the money we're spending. This is so expensive. And we're wondering, is there really going to be a payout? Are we really going to earn or get anything for this? Now, of course, we know hindsight, right? We get all sorts of scientific discoveries from this, but we don't know that at the time. So you also need to keep in mind that in the 1960s, we have a lot of other things going on. We have the civil rights movement, the women's rights movement, Indian American rights movement, the war in Vietnam. We've just gotten out of Korea. There's a lot of other things going on that we are probably spending money on or needing to spend money on. And the space race doesn't make the top 10 for most Americans. It's just not day to day as important as some of those other things. Having said that, though, we do have some early successes for NASA. First, of course, the Mercury manned space flight. We are also going to see Project Gemini, which gets a human spaceflight, and the goal was to develop techniques to support the coming Apollo missions. And then I'm going to assume that most of you know this one, Apollo 11. In July of 1969, just under that deadline that Kennedy set, we get a man to the moon. I'm going to assume that most of you know who the first person to walk on the moon was. So if you guys can, in the chat, type the name of the first person who walked on the moon. Who was the first man that made it to the moon? Y'all nailed it, Neil Armstrong. All right, the reason I wanted you guys to do that was because in the 1970s, there were again Gallup polls done. A majority of Americans could not name Neil Armstrong. It was only about 40% of Americans that right off the bat knew his name. The reason that we know his name is that because in hindsight, this is becoming an important part of our history. But at the time that it was done, not that many people knew. All right, one more quiz question for you guys. In the Apollo missions, start to finish, how many people walked on the moon? What number of astronauts put their feet on the lunar surface? Michelle nailed it. 12. Exactly. 12 people put their feet on the moon. Again, at the time, most Americans couldn't give you that number. but we can. This is one of the only statistics that younger Americans have better recall of and more immediate recall of than older Americans who lived through it. It's just this weird quirk of history that space travel has become so important as part of our history that we know these back facts that people that lived through it didn't necessarily know at the time. So, along with some early successes, we also need to talk about some early failures. The first big failure comes with Apollo 1. This is February of 1967. The Apollo 1 has a cabin fire, and 3 members of the crew were killed during that. The next major concern for NASA is their budget. I put this on the screen for you guys because I want you to see the dramatic fall in the budget there. We get to the moon, we planted our flag, we did that, we succeeded in meeting Kennedy's goal, and then immediately our national focus switches. It's going to go other places. And so that budget starts to fall. The next big interesting thing that is going to happen after this is Apollo 13. Again, I'm going to assume most of you, because there was a movie, know about Apollo 13. I don't want to go too far into it. All you need to know is that 1970, an oxygen tank explodes, and there is a crisis with this crew, but they do manage to get home and get home safely. This is your Apollo crew. And this is all of the newspapers showing what's going on. So for about 6 days, there is this intense national focus on Apollo. We are very, very concerned about this crew, but they make it home safely. This almost creates this false sense of security that nothing can go wrong. NASA is so well prepared. NASA is so professional that even when there's a crisis, they figure it out and everyone gets home safe. This kind of has a double-edged effect, though, on NASA, because we now believe that they're incredibly competent and they're incredibly secure, but secure and competent things are not interesting. NASA wants you to believe that spaceflight is as safe as going on an airline, flying to New York City. The problem is, none of you guys go to the airport to watch planes take off. It's too boring. We know it's going to be safe, so we don't pay attention. And public approval starts to fall off. It's not that we are not proud of NASA. It's not that we're not invested in their mission. It's that it's kind of boring. Everything's always going to be okay. So why do we need to keep doing this? Kennedy's goal is accomplished, and NASA has become at this point a victim of their own success. There is a loss of novelty here. The missions aren't as heroic. Another thing that happens that's really important here that we need to talk about is that NASA makes a shift from these early missions, these men that we call the space cowboys, because they're kind of flamboyant and wild and they're fun to talk about, to more professional and again, kind of boring crews, a lot more engineers and physicists. Again, not that they're not important, they're just not as much fun. They don't give us fun of interviews, right? So we are going to see NASA make a shift, and they're looking for ways to get the public involved and keep the public support, keep it interesting. One of the technical shifts that I'm not going to talk a whole bunch about, and hopefully Professor Ray will, is that we shift from the rockets we had been using to shuttles because they can be reused and they are more cost efficient. We also see NASA looking for some public relations bits. How can we get people invested? So I think probably a lot of you know this story, but one of the things they thought was, what if we put a celebrity in space? Somebody everybody loves. You guys know it's really hard to find a celebrity everybody loves. Everybody's got, I like them, I don't like them, I'm bored by them, this, that, the other. But everybody loves Big Bird, right? Who doesn't love Big Bird? And so there was a thought, maybe we could put Big Bird in space. And the original floating idea here is we're going to put Big Bird on the Challenger. This was discussed. It was never too far down the planning. It wasn't like he was almost on the tarmac and doesn't get on. What we found was the puppeteering was going to be a little too hard. It just wasn't going to work. And so this is briefly floated, but then we back off of that. So another idea is, well, what if we put civilians in space? And y'all, we're living through this era right now. We've seen civilians go to space now. Katy Perry has gone to space. So we sent some senators, some government officials, a Saudi prince. None of that really captured the public's imagination, though. So NASA's going to go back to the drawing board and think about how can we get the public invested? And remember, if we keep the public invested, we get money, we get a bigger budget. And so the next idea is, what if we put a teacher, a civilian teacher in space? And so NASA is going to create a program called Teacher in Space, TISP for short. It's announced by Ronald Reagan in 1984. And the whole idea is going to inspire students, teachers, spur interest in mathematics, science, and of course, space exploration. Children from all around are going to watch this as it happens. And then our teacher that we put in space is going to do some science experiments for us or teach us a social studies lesson. Do something in space, be a teacher while amongst the stars. We had 11,000 teachers apply. All 50 states sent at least one person. We get down to 10 finalists. These are your finalists right here. And they're going to go through a series of meetings, training, some psychological evaluations, and we are going to narrow it down to Christy McAuliffe and then her backup, Barbara Morgan, in case anything happens to Christy. She gets sick, there's a family emergency, something like that. Barbara could step in. So Christy McAuliffe is chosen. She is a social studies teacher from Concord, New Hampshire, and she is going to serve as a payload specialist. She takes 1 year off of her teaching position to go train, and she is going to do an excellent job. I highly recommend, if you guys get a chance, go look up her interviews. She is just so warm and bubbly and friendly in these interviews, and she is so clearly excited about this that it's really easy to see why they picked her. She was going to be a fantastic ambassador for space. This is part of her training. And the reason I wanted to show you guys this particular photograph is if you look behind her and you see the land there, that's Galveston. So we're getting a little bit of Texas history in here too. All right, so let's talk about the actual Challenger mission. This is your Challenger crew. Formally, this is STS-51L. This is going to be the crew of people that go into space. We have Francis Scobie, who is the commander, Michael Smith is a pilot, Judith Resnick is a mission specialist, Ellison Ozunka is a mission specialist, Robert McNair is a mission specialist. This man on the end here is Robert McNair. If you have a chance, go look up his StoryCorps oral history interview. It's done by his brother, and it's truly a fantastic interview. Uh, Gregory Jarvis is a payload specialist, and then Christy McAuliffe is the other payload specialist and the teacher in space. Now, when we send crews, they each get their own emblem or seal. This is the one for the Challenger. There's a couple of things on here I want you guys to see. First off, by McAuliffe's name, there's a little apple that represents that she's a teacher. We have Halley's Comet passing by because they were going to witness that while they were in space. And if you look at the flag in the background, there are 7 stars for the 7 astronauts. So we really think that this is going to be a huge success, especially public relations success for NASA. These are not space cowboys. These are all professionals, and they are all highly trained. This is an image of them training. For the entire time that McAuliffe is training, there are photographs being taken, there's interviews being done. She's on TV a lot, especially in those morning shows, giving interviews. So we're drumming up interest in this, trying to get the public truly, truly invested. The launch is scheduled to take place in 1986, again, after about a year and a little more of training. NASA in 86 releases a statement that says eventually they would like to have 50 flights a year taking place, and that this is the first piece of doing that. Again, we're going to have this launch televised. We are also going to have across the nation school children sitting in their classes watching this. And this is where I said Lisa Blank gets a little cameo here, because Lisa Blank was in 2nd grade and she was one of the students in Texas watching this take off. You guys can also go find media of Christy McAuliffe's former class watching their former teacher on this launch, and that is some really heartbreaking footage there. So today's date, 40 years ago, January 28th, 1986, is the day of the launch. This day is unseasonably cold. We think it was somewhere around 36 degrees, but that's just the air temperature. Part of the Challenger is in the shade. And so even if the air temperature is 36, if it's in the shade, it's going to be a little cooler than that. So at 11:38 a.m., the crew is cleared to launch. Now, the crew actually didn't think they were going to launch that day. The crew has been delayed twice already. They were supposed to launch on the 25th and then they're supposed to launch on the 27th, but it was too cold on both of those days. So they do not launch. What we are worried about is the O-rings. And I'm not going to talk a whole lot about that because y'all don't want to hear science from me, I promise. It would be bad. But the O-rings had been a previous concern. In 1985, when the Discovery launched, there was a record-breaking cold spell, and the engineers, when they recovered the shuttle from the ocean, they were very concerned to see that there had been damage to the O-rings. And one of the crew members, one of the engineers said they were astonished that the Discovery had not been blown to pieces on the launch pad. This was a happy accident that nothing happened in 1985. So the crew themselves have not been informed about the O-rings, just that the weather is challenging. But again, 11:38, the call is made, and this is going to go forward. About 73 seconds after launch, as people are watching live, we see this disaster. Now, in the media and most people watching, laymen called this an explosion. That's not technically correct, but it is a disaster. 73 seconds after they lost, there's a disaster, and the crew of the Challenger is killed. Now, to explain the science behind that, I'm going to stop presenting, and I'm going to pass the baton because, again, y'all don't want to hear me talk about science, I promise.
Okay. Well, I'm Ray Benj, and I am going to be taking the next part of this. So I teach physics and astronomy at Northeast Campus. So let me see if I can share my screen. I can't really see what you're seeing. Can you all see that?
Yes.
Yeah, it
can
looks
see.
like, yeah. Okay. All right. So there's me. And historians will probably find all kind of explanations for this, but whenever you are out there and so you hear about some fantastic or huge event in history and you were around for it, you tend to remember where you were and what happened, but you sometimes get it wrong. And for years, I was thinking, oh, I remember watching this live. Now I knew I didn't sit and watch it because I was in graduate school, had class that day, and after class, I and several other graduate students went over to a place to get lunch, and this was on TV there. And I remember watching it live and looking up, and I'm this huge space fan, have been for years and years and years, and I always have been watching the space program and so forth, and watching the launches. And I was even that nerd that bought the little book that is the space shuttle manual about the launches. And so that was me. And so when I was um, watching this, I immediately knew what had happened, and that's not supposed to happen. There's several ways that an abort can happen if the launch doesn't go right, and that image doesn't show any of those. And so it's like, what's going on here? Um, it turns out as I was preparing for this, I looked at the timeline and said, well, I could not have been watching because I was in class. So I must have gotten there right afterwards when they were showing the replay. But nonetheless, this was a shock. Uh, but it wasn't the first time that there was a loss of life, nor was it the last. Misty already talked about the Apollo 1. Technically, it was the AS-204 mission. They named it posthumously Apollo 1, in which an accident happened. There was a fire aboard the spacecraft. They never launched. They were sitting on the launch pad testing things. Before they launched, they went through a simulated mission. When they went through a simulated mission, they closed up the hatch. They went through the entire mission as if they were launching. But this is where there were some issues. NASA is a government agency. As such, you like to think NASA is run by engineers. Well, it's really run by politicians. And budget cuts, even in the early days of the Apollo program, were making them combine tests. So they were pressure testing the capsule with pure oxygen. At the same time, the crew was inside going through a simulated mission. And a spark occurred, fire occurred, all three astronauts, Grissom, Chaffee, and White, died. It almost put an end to the Apollo missions at the time because they had to reevaluate. NASA had their own internal study as to what happened, and they issued an incredibly scathing report about the sort of decision making that went into this. And in the end, what they did was they reevaluated things and supposedly made safety a priority. Ironically, safety issues slipped up and they did have the accident with Apollo 13, but at least people survived there. 2003, right over Texas, Space Shuttle Columbia was re-entering the atmosphere and it broke apart. Ironically, a similar issue had happened. They had a long stream of very safe or very successful flights and bad decision making on the launch. They had recently changed how they did the external tank. Pieces were flaking off in previous flights, which had damaged earlier flights. And with the Columbia, similar thing happened. Knocked a hole in the leading edge of the heat shield for the wing. And as they re-entered, hot gases got in and basically ate away at the wing. The wing collapsed. The thing tumbled, broke apart, and flaming pieces came raining down all over Texas and Louisiana. Again, it turned out that they launched primarily because they were told to launch by politicians who said, look, we're scheduled to launch. I can talk more about it later, but hey, we got plenty of other stuff to talk about this particular accident. So the Apollo missions went to the moon. It was a fantastic thing. Scientists and engineers were thinking, hey, wow, we're going to the moon, and in just a few decades we went to the Wright brothers saying, hey, I want to fly like a bird, to landing on the moon. And they kind of anticipated that same kind of space flight would keep going. And so they were looking at a permanent moon base to really study the moon, the geology of the moon, how the moon interacts with the Earth, study the minerals on the moon, because we now know the moon contains a lot of minerals that are very valuable here on Earth and very difficult to get to, but very easy to get to on the moon. And so they were thinking about that. They wanted a space station to orbit the Earth, to do scientific experiments, and to serve as a stepping stone to a mission to Mars. And then to support all that, they wanted a space shuttle that would fly up and down to the space station. And budget cuts basically meant they just got the shuttle. The technical name is really the Space Transportation System. Space shuttle is the layman's term for it. The idea is that you have on the back end of this thing, you have these three main engines right there. We call them main engines, but actually you get more thrust from these two solid rockets strapped to the side. Now, the solid rockets are the problem. NASA originally did not use solid rockets. They used liquid fueled rockets because you can turn on and off the liquid fueled rockets. Basically, the solid rocket is a big tube filled with something that's not overly dissimilar from gunpowder. and you set it off and it burns until it burns out. You don't throttle up. You can't change the thrust. It basically keeps going until it's all gone. You can't turn it off, can't turn it off, or you can't turn it off, can't turn it back on. And so for safety reasons, they'd always done the liquid fuel rockets. As a compromise for the budget, they used the solid rockets, which provide a lot more thrust. The other thing was space flights were enormously expensive. As Misty said, this was a huge portion of the budget to go to the moon. Building those rockets, and you throw away the rocket when you're done, was really expensive. I mean, imagine if you wanted to have an airplane flight to Chicago, you go over to American Airlines, instead of just purchasing a seat, you had to actually pay for maybe 1% or 2% of the price of the airplane. And then they fly it to Chicago, they land, and they trash it. And you had to buy part of an airplane to fly back. That would make air travel unreasonably expensive. And so the goal was to have a reusable spacecraft. And so the plan that came up with was we're going to compromise in order to meet budgetary guidelines and to meet the timeline, was to have something that takes off and flies back like an airplane, it glides back like an airplane. The solid rockets push it up there. They fall off and the sides and are recovered and reused. The orbiter lands, recovered, reused, and the only thing you throw away is this big thing out on the outside, which is a big tank, fuel tank for hydrogen that was fuel for the main engine for the orbiter, and for an oxygen, which you burn with hydrogen. Okay, so that was the basic plan of the shuttle system. Now, the one thing about it was it had no escape mechanism. And that's different from everything that came before. The Mercury flights, Mercury Redstone and Mercury Atlas, which is the picture right here, it's John Glenn's flight, have a little rocket on top of the capsule that it would fire and yank the capsule off of that rocket if something went wrong. Same thing with the Apollo missions. You have an escape tower up here, which would yank the capsule off of the top of the rocket itself if something went wrong. For the Gemini missions, they actually had ejection seats that would shoot them out. And so that became the plan, for these early rockets, but not for the space shuttle. For the space shuttle, that was not an option right there. Now, why not? Well, the first couple of space shuttle missions actually did have an escape system, and it did have ejection seats that would shoot the pilot and the commander out of the top of the shuttle. Those were the experimental flights. Later missions, they realized that wasn't feasible because you're talking maybe $10,000, $12,000, $25,000 per pound in modern currency to put something up. And the second, ejection seats are heavy. So to save money, they took them out. Secondly, there was only 2 places you could eject from, and that would leave the rest of the astronauts inside this thing, while 2 escaped. So they said that's not going to work. So they took all that out. And they said, instead, what's going to happen is, since they'd been so successful with all these rockets, they would launch and they just ride into orbit. If things started failing, then when the solid rockets expended themselves, the orbiter could detach and glide back to Florida. Otherwise, they could fire the engines a little bit more, coast across the Atlantic Ocean, land in Europe. So there's several options there, but escaping was not an option. So the Challenger, when they got ready to go, had no escape mechanism, but they thought they didn't need it because they had been so successful. So the Challenger rolls out to the launch pad and gets ready to launch. And again, what's supposed to happen is it rides all the way up to the point where the solid rockets are about to run out of fuel, and they detach at the front and they peel away, and then the back parts detach, and then the orbiter keeps firing for a little bit more to get into orbit. Okay. Now the solid rockets look like they're one big solid thing on the outside right here, but in reality they're made up of a whole bunch of individual segments in there, and those individual segments uh, 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 um, tend to have a property there that's a problem. Okay, so I hope you're back to seeing me. Is that right? Okay.
Yeah.
So you think of the solid rocket as being this one big rocket right there, but it's really made up of a whole bunch of individual segments that go together. When these segments go together, that's the problem. Okay. So let me go back to sharing my screen. Okay. All right. So these individual segments, when they go together, they come together, then what happens is that they slide together, and where they slide together, there's a slight joint. Well, there's a little bit of overlap where they slide together, but there's still a slight joint there. And the problem is that as all this fuel on the inside's burning, these hot gases that are supposed to go down the bottom of the the rocket and out the back and push the spacecraft forward, can actually, the hot gases can, like a tongue of fire, go shooting out the sides here. And obviously you don't want that. So the solution for that was, right where the segments slide together, they put a gasket. And the gasket is basically this little ring that completely circles the rocket. And that little gasket right there, it looks like a little O, and so we call it an O-ring. Well, y'all have all been using O-rings. You didn't know it. In the engine of your car, you've got pistons, and the pistons are going up and down inside of a cylinder. Well, when you ignite the gasoline and it burns, you want that to push on the cylinder. You don't want to go shooting past the cylinder into the body of the engine. And so there's a little ring around there. And that kind of is what holds the gas in there. So this O-ring is supposed to hold the gases inside the engine, not letting it out. Fantastic. For safety reasons, they had a second O-ring past the first O-ring. Okay. So that was the idea. Now, the problem with that is that right where these O-rings come together, this flexes where that flexes right where the rocket is, because it's not one segment, it's all these individual pieces, and the solid rockets don't burn evenly. They increase decrease thrust, air resistance pushing back and forth here, air resistance pushing back, the whole rocket shimmies back and forth, these things flex, and these O-rings get alternately squeezed and unsqueezed. And so when they're unsqueezed, a little bit of gas can go by, and that was normally expected. And so the O-rings were sized in such a way that that probably wouldn't happen. If it did happen, there's a secondary O-ring that's there. And again, that was the plan. Now, some engineers, even before all of this, said, no, I think there's a problem here. I don't really think that this is properly going to seal in certain circumstances. We also know those O-rings have to flex just a little bit. If they do not flex, then when the rocket shimmies, gas is going to get passed. When the O-rings are really hot, they get sticky and it doesn't work well. When the O-rings get really cold, they get stiff and they don't actually flex. So there's a window of temperatures that these things have to be in. They were tested from about 40 degrees to about 90 degrees Fahrenheit. Now, obviously, conditions change in flight, but that's what they were tested for. And so, criteria for launch was they did not want to launch the temperatures too low. Okay. So now we get to the Challenger flight, STS-51L. Again, NASA, government agencies, so they do bureaucratic sort of things. The first few space flights were STS-1, STS-2, STS-3, and so forth. And then they started changing how they wanted to do this. The problem is that it is so expensive to launch a space shuttle. The goal here was to save money by having a reusable craft. But it takes a huge amount of money to process it. It's not like an airplane, you land and then you simply put more fuel in, you take off again. What they had to do is they had to land, they had to rebuild the external tanks, they had to go through every little part of the shuttle and check everything and replace things that worn out, update this, update that. It's enormous expenses. There's an army of people that work on this thing. They got to be paid whether they're doing a shuttle or not doing a shuttle. And so NASA also realized that if they could get commercial companies to pay them to take satellites into orbit, they could make more money. And so they kind of did an internal sort of analysis saying the shuttle program really does not save money unless you have somewhere around close to 50 shuttle flights a year. And so what they did was they said, well, we need to have more and more shuttle flights. Well, they never had anywhere close to that. 1985, they had 9 shuttle flights. That was as close as they got. And that was 1984 is when they started renumbering these things. Instead of doing 1, 2, 3, 4, they said we're going to do it STS for Space Transportation System. And the next digit is what budgetary year, 4 or 5 would be 1984, 1985 budget year, and then ABCD for where it's going to be. The second number there, the 1, would indicate it's launching from Kennedy. 2 would have been launching from Vandenberg Air Force Base because they were building a second launch site. Because in order to get that many shuttles off, you need more than just the 2 launch pads at Kennedy. You need a third launch pad at Vandenberg. And so they came up with this new bureaucratic way of numbering, which they thought would be simpler, but like most bureaucratic ways of doing things, it's more complicated. So, as Misty said, to try to get people interested, to get more interest in the space shuttle, they were trying various things. The teacher in space, that was honestly a publicity sort of thing, just to get something going on. They were also going to launch the TDRA satellite, which was a data relay satellite, so that in future shuttle missions and scientific missions, they could send data to the satellite, which would then go back to Earth, rather than having to wait until the shuttle was over a ground station to send data back. Comet Halley was approaching in 1986, and so they had several studies on there. They weren't just going to look at it; they actually had some scientific monitoring equipment that was going to monitor Halley's Comet. They had other scientific experiments on board. This was basically a science mission. While the space shuttle was originally conceived as a shuttle to and from a space station, they didn't have a space station yet. And so they would carry spacecraft into orbit. They would carry science missions into orbit and so forth. And the idea was eventually start carrying pieces of a space station up, which they eventually did. Okay, so this was the mission profile for the STS-51L. It launched in 1986, but it was part of the 1985 budget cycle for the federal government, which runs from October through September. Okay. Now, the problem was it was cold. it got down to about, they think about 18 degrees or so overnight. At the original launch time, it was still not above freezing. It was in the 20s. And so they delayed launch. Now, in the meantime, engineers who knew about the problem with the shuttle and the O-rings were raising the alarm. They said, we got a problem. This is way outside of launch parameters. Bureaucratic people were saying, well, we're scheduled to launch, and if we don't get this thing off the launch pad, we're not going to free up the launch pad for more missions. We're not going to meet our goal for having more missions this year. And so what we want to do is we want to say, well, we got to do something. So they said, we got to launch. The engineers said, well, no, we don't think it's safe to launch. And so they had a conference call overnight with Thiokol, that was the actual manufacturer of the solid rocket boosters. And the engineers at Thiokol said they are not comfortable with this. As Misty said, there were previous missions in which there was a little bit of flexure, and the O-rings didn't completely seal, and some gas did get out. When that gas got out, going past the O-ring, it actually scorched the O-ring, and it did not seal well beyond that. The secondary O-ring held, but just barely. Well, this was way colder than the coldest flight that was before. And so the engineers were saying, I don't think we ought to be launching here. Politicians, and bureaucrats, we got to launch. First of all, we've got all this media attention. We got the news crews there. Were supposed to have launched this thing, originally some time ago. We got to get it off right now because everybody is sitting there watching. This is to be an embarrassing sort of thing. We had delayed it earlier this week. We got to launch. If we don't launch, this is embarrassing for NASA. Everybody was launching live TV. I think in the chat, someone asked, were the decisions related to TV ratings? And my answer to that is probably yes. That this was a public sort of thing, and the bureaucrats did not understand the science behind it, did not understand the engineering behind it. Were saying we need to launch because we're scheduled to launch, and everybody is watching us. Engineers were saying we're not so sure. We don't know what's going to happen because we haven't tested it. It was 18 degrees overnight, had warmed up to 36 degrees. That's the air temperature. That structure was sitting out and cold overnight. It doesn't warm up at the same speed that the air warms up. So deep inside those rockets, it's still cold. O-rings have never been tested below 40 degrees. The air temperature is below 40 degrees. Internal readings indicate that the solid rockets themselves had gotten way colder than that. Solid rockets themselves were like 20 something degrees at some point during the night. There's no way they were above 40 degrees. The recommended minimum temperature to launch was 53 degrees. There was one flight that was launched a while earlier that was just below that minimum temperature, and there they did have leaking gases, and that was really a concern. This is much colder than that. So the engineers were saying, we don't think we should launch. The bureaucrats are saying, if you don't agree to launch, I can find someone else to take your job that will agree to launch. And so they kind of reluctantly agree. This is almost exactly the same sort of decisions that were made with Apollo 1. This is almost exactly the same sort of decisions that were made with Columbia. Okay. Why launch? Well, because the schedule said to launch. Politicians were embarrassed. This is a bad PR thing for NASA if they can't get this thing off the ground. So they decided to go with it. So they went ahead and gave the okay to launch. within seconds of lighting the engines. The solid rockets started having a puff of gas that came out around one of those O-ring seals. At this point, there's nothing you can do. First of all, uh, uh, this image here is from a camera that was taking pictures here, which they looked at after the accident. They did not notice this necessarily live when it was happening. If they did notice it, there's nothing that could be done. They had already ignited the solid rockets. There's nothing you can do once the rockets are ignited. You go along for the ride, period. You cannot turn them off. That's why before this, NASA had avoided using solid rockets. There's no abort. So they're along for the ride. You cannot just detach the solid rockets at any point, other because the main engines weren't powerful enough to keep the shuttle from crashing back to the ground with that kind of weight level. So you had to ride the thing up, even if they knew that there was something wrong. Worse, you can't just detach the engine at any point. Otherwise, the difference in stress, difference in forces would then rip the rest of the shuttle apart. So you don't want to do that. So again, you're just along for the ride at this point. Might be actually good they didn't know that things were going this bad at the time. So as they're going, that puff of smoke went away. The puff of smoke went away probably because of, now I'll use in layman's terms, soot. That as the fuel was burning, soot plugged the gap in the burned O-ring. They were already burning through the O-rings, and soot plugged it. Now, technically, any chemist in here would flip out that I called it soot because it's not chemically soot as you know it, but it is combustion byproducts temporarily plug that. So a little over a minute into flight, they're going faster and faster and faster, and they reach supersonic velocities. The air pressure on the shuttle is huge. The air pressure going by, this is what we call max Q. And so what happens is that they throttled back the main engine somewhat to get past this region of maximum aerodynamic stress. But this is where it gets really bumpy. And as it gets really bumpy, most likely the solid rocket segments flexed. That soot, as I'm calling it, got out of the way. You're really interested in aluminum oxides, but it got out of the way and hot gases started coming out. And so in this image here, you see what looks like a tongue of flame coming out the side of the solid rocket. That tongue of flame was not just there. It's actually in the picture. It's hard to see what's happening. It's not coming out from the side. It's actually coming out from the inside, adjacent to the big external tank, which remember is filled with hydrogen and oxygen. And so what happens is it's starting to burn away. Now, it's not really burning into the engine necessarily. It's burning the strut that's holding the engine. It's probably damaging the external tank anyway. Then what happens is just seconds later on board, that strut actually starts to give away. As it gives way, this external rocket starts to push back a little bit from the external tank. As the strut pulls back and rips in a place it's not supposed to be moving, it actually tears apart part of the external tank. Onboard instruments show right away that there's a loss of pressure in the hydrogen tank. And then the last recorded voice from aboard the shuttle said, uh-oh, because they realized something's going wrong. Now, at this point, they did not know what was happening here, but they know there's a loss of pressure in the external tank. That means probably the main engines are going to go out. That means they're probably not going to achieve orbit. They're going to have to go into one of the abort modes, and the two different possible abort modes that they have at this point are keep going until the solid rockets exhaust themselves and detach, and the orbiter can detach and glide back to Kennedy. Or if they can go a little bit farther, if the main engines don't cut out right away, they can keep thrusting to give them a big arc that allows them to coast all the way across the Atlantic Ocean and land in Europe. So that's probably what they were thinking at the time, but that's not what happened. As that tank pulled away, then what happened was that the external tank then started to disintegrate. The hydrogen and oxygen mixed together, pushed through. You have I mean, again, you can call it an explosion of stuff. The solid rocket separate. Now, one of them just kept on going because it was doing fine, and the other one got twisted and pirouetted around. And so I remember, watching this, in graduate school, seeing this image right here and saying, oh, that's exactly not what's supposed to be happening, because I knew exactly what these things were supposed to be doing, that is a catastrophic failure. And I remember one of the other guys with me said, what happened? And the guy behind the counter at the restaurant said, it's a major malfunction. And I'm thinking, that's just not a major malfunction. That's the loss of vehicle. And at this point, the range safety officer realizes the external tanks are firing out of control. They could arch over and hit the ground, explode like missiles. And so he presses the button that causes them to self-destruct. The orbiter itself was not blown apart in this, probably. What happened was that as the structure all around it disintegrated, the orbiter was twisted into an orientation that the huge air pressures literally ripped it apart. It ripped the wings off, ripped the tail off, snapped it in half. The individual pieces started separating. Ironically, the crew capsule most likely survived. Not maybe totally intact, but somewhat intact. And so now there's been debate over the years as to whether the astronauts were conscious all the way down until they hit the ocean, or if they lost consciousness. Probably they lost consciousness shortly afterwards, though there's evidence they did survive the initial event, because several of them had turned on their emergency oxygen supply right afterwards. So they were losing pressure in the cabin, but it started tumbling to the point they probably lost consciousness shortly after that. Okay. So everybody is in shock. What happened? NASA had never lost a flight in launch before. Yeah, Apollo 1 on the launch pad during a test, but in flight, they had never lost anything. Apollo 13, that probably should have been a loss of mission right there, except they worked out the problems and they managed to make it back. So they had this confidence that they could overcome any problem that happened. So afterwards, the Rogers Commission studied this. They had scientists and engineers studied what was going on, what happened. And they looked at the design of the space shuttle to begin with. And they said, well, was this even a good design? No, it wasn't a good design. This was a compromise design. It was a compromise to fit the schedule and to fit the economics. It's the best they could do at the time. What about the decisions that happened? What kind of decisions were made? Well, those decisions, as I said, the engineers were uncomfortable with this thing launching. And they said, well, maybe we shouldn't launch in the first place. That should have been an immediate no, don't launch. It wasn't because they had basically other sort of considerations. Again, my personal opinion from what I've read about this and studied about it is that it became a political and public relations sort of decision rather than a scientific or engineering decision. Okay. So the entire thing put about 2.5 year pause on the shuttle flights. Said we're not going to launch until we figure out what went wrong and can we fix it. 2.5 years had a significant change in NASA's strategy for how they moved forward, uh, uh, and then a complete realization here that they had gotten lucky. That space travel is way more dangerous than they were kind of getting a feel for. Yeah, of course it's dangerous. You're sitting on top of an enormous amount of very explosive stuff and you're barely containing it. Yes, that's very expensive and very, very dangerous. But they had gotten away with it long. A lot of people do things that are dangerous and they don't get hurt, and they keep doing it until something goes wrong and they get hurt or killed. And so this is a similar sort of concept right here. So what they did was they analyzed what happened and said, well, how do we fix it moving forward? Okay. So first step is they redesign the tang or the place, the joint where all this comes together so that they have, bigger O-rings in there that seal better, better tested O-rings, and another O-ring, and they also put a little ledge on there that keeps it from flexing as much, and that puts less stress on the O-rings themselves. And so that was kind of a very expensive refit, added quite a lot to the process of actually fitting the segments together, which increased the price of the shuttle. There's no way at this point the shuttle would ever be able to pay for itself, even if they sold flights, commercial trips into space, for private citizens, or sold trips into space to private companies to take their own satellite. There's no way it would ever pay for itself. The other thing they did was they said, well, we need some kind of escape mechanism because the shuttle had none. So they came up with an escape mechanism that probably would have done nothing to help the Challenger. And that is to basically, at the airlock, have a great big pole that sticks out. And the astronauts could then slide out the pole and drop down wearing a parachute and parachute to safety. Now, the problem is if at really high altitudes, you pass out from lack of oxygen. So the other thing they did was they started putting pressure suits on the astronaut. Now, these are not full-on space suits that are able to handle zero atmospheric pressure. Um, what happened was that these were like high altitude suits like the U-2 or the SR-71 Air Force pilots wore that would help them in low pressure environments, so they could still got the first few missions of the Space Shuttle Columbia when they first launched were test missions, and they wore these kind of suits. Later missions, once they got past the test region, they kind of got sort of complacent, and they said this is so safe, and so they were going up in just regular jumpsuits, NASA jumpsuits, shirt sleeves, and so now they can put pressure suits back on them. And finally, they created NASA's Office of Safety, Reliability, and Quality Assurance that was supposedly able to overrule the politicians and the bureaucrats and say, this is not safe. This is how we need to do this. Uh, um, so I think real quickly, a question popped up in the chat: were the families allowed to sue? And you can always sue, but no, not really. uh, 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 you don't really sue because I've been to actually a shuttle launch, not shuttle launch, but a test rocket launch. And before you go, you sign a waiver, even if you're there just observing from miles away. You sign a waiver saying that you realize that space flight is dangerous and that there's a possibility of failure. No, you can't sue. Now lawyers can always say, hey, I know we signed that, and but anyway, so um can you sue? Not really. Okay. All right. So this was some of what they did. They also made another change. President Reagan made a presidential order which has never been rescinded, and that is from this point on that manned missions are only going to fly for those missions that require manned missions. If it could be done unmanned rocket, they'll do it with an unmanned rocket. Up to this point, they were trying to use the space shuttle to do everything in order to get that 50 or so flights per year in order to make the shuttles self-sustaining. Okay. So these are some of the changes. Now, ironically, 2003, we have another launch of a space shuttle. And once again, it comes down to they're launching under adverse conditions, not quite as cold, but they had, for political reasons, changed how they were doing the external tanks. The way they were doing the external tanks was environmentally unfriendly, so they changed to a new way of doing the external tanks, which had the annoying thing of pieces of the external tank, the foam insulation falling off. This particular external tank for the Columbia in STS 107, because by the way, after the Challenger, they went back to the just sequential numbering. So right after the Challenger 51L mission, the next one was STS 26. So up to 107, Columbia was launched. Once again, they were scheduled to launch, and a previous mission, some of that foam had come off and actually hit one of the struts holding one of the external rockets and nearly broke it off. It made a massive gouge dent in it, and engineers were like terrified that that might happen again and cause another loss of mission during launch. So they were recommending holding off the launch. Uh, but they were scheduled to launch the Columbia again. They'd already delayed some things, and they wanted to get. They were trying to build the International Space Station. Need to get this thing off the launch pad so they could get another shuttle out there to carry parts to the space station. Again, bureaucrats in charge of NASA, and again, you normally think NASA bureaucrats are going to be scientists or engineers. No, they're political appointees. And at least one NASA administrator used to work for the Social Security Administration before he was made NASA administrator. So they made decisions that were based on other things. And again, this was a cold time of the year. In January, they had this damaged tank. It rained on it. They had then put more foam up there, but there's probably water underneath. And then when you fill liquid hydrogen, liquid oxygen, that stuff's cryogenic fluid, it's super cold, and that's going to freeze that water. Frozen water is obviously ice. And so what happened was when this launched, this big chunk of foam and ice came down and slammed into the leading edge of the Columbia, smashed the tiles that were protecting it from the hot gases of reentry. And so what happened was that it basically at that point was doomed. There was not a good way of reentering. Now, this is where more politics and bureaucracy comes in, that when they had seen this piece come down and hit the shuttle on launch, but they decided to go ahead and they had a commission that was going to study this, see what to do. Could anything have been done? Not sure. That's a whole separate story right there. Okay. So we can come back and have another episode about the Columbia accident, later. But there's a whole story there, what happened, and the studies here, and unfortunately, part of the group that was doing the studying, they went home for the weekend, long weekend, didn't come back, and by the time they finally got back to studying what had happened, it was too late to do any kind of rescue anyway. But as it re-entered the atmosphere, again, they basically were told, while they didn't want to launch, engineers were concerned about launching, the NASA administrator had gotten all these engineers at the Johnson Space Center together in a big meeting and said, look, you're falling behind on schedule. If you can't launch, we can replace you with people who can actually do their job. And so they kind of launched even though they weren't sure about it, and it ended up being another loss of mission, and another 7 astronauts died. Again, I'm not a big fan when politicians and bureaucrats overrun the scientists or people in the field that are actually doing things. But that again, that's a separate sort of issue. Very, very sadly, while Apollo 1, Challenger, and Columbia, 3 separate loss of life accidents, had 3 separate proximal causes, deep in the decision tree, you still had the same thing that happened, and that was bureaucrats saying, well, we need to launch because we're scheduled to launch. And so anyway, I could say a whole lot more. I could talk on and on and on, but at this point, I think I'll turn this back over to Chloe, the organizer here, and then open it up to any kind of questions that people might have.
Yes, thank you. We're going to share, go back to Misty for a second, just to share a little bit about the aftermath of this too in the US and how people responded to this event. So, Misty, did you want to kind of wrap up something here? Okay.
Okay, so immediately afterwards, Reagan's going to ask for a presidential commission, which, like Ray said, is called the Rogers Commission. And this gets published in June of '86. That is, I cannot even stress this enough, light speed for a government commission to be published. In that commission, the mechanical failures are pretty straightforward and very uncontroversial. It's very clear what happened. But part of the Rogers Commission looks at the human failures. And this is much, much, much more interesting. So, like Ray was saying, there are 3 primary human failures here. The first is considered political timing. Ronald Reagan was going to give his State of the Union address. It had already been written, and there are parts in it that refer to Christy McCullough being in space. And so, if she's not in space, they have to rewrite the speech. NASA is not necessarily told they have to launch, but they are told that Reagan's going to mention this in his speech. And so there is pressure there, intentional or not, from the White House to NASA to get this thing off the ground. Second is media focus. The media is there. They've been waiting 4 days now for this thing to launch. And if it doesn't launch, they're going to write more stories about how it didn't launch. NASA internally says those first 2 things are the major failures. However, the Rogers Commission also cites something which was later referred to as go fever. It's this idea that we have everything set up. We need a good PR moment. We need to close this chapter. We need funding. We got to go. So go fever is one of the reasons this happened. And that's also, like Ray said, cited in the Columbia report. It just needed to happen the day that we said it was going to happen. The bodies are recovered in March. It took quite a bit of time for them to be recovered, and they are now buried at Arlington National Cemetery. That's what you're seeing on your screen right there is their memorial plaque. And then we got to talk about the national response, which Dr. Northrup's going to talk about this a little bit more. But this is a national moment, a watershed moment, a touchstone moment, whatever you want to call it. We have kids in school watching. CNN aired the whole thing live. CNN was relatively new at this point. They didn't cut away. Almost every other network does cut away. CNN does not. And there's a little trick of memory here happening. Like Ray said, he remembers seeing it live, and then later he realized, no, I couldn't have seen that live. I was in school. That's the case for a lot of people. We remember seeing it live, even though we actually probably saw a replay later that day on the national or in the evening news. Reagan is going to finally address the nation. A couple of days later, he moved the State of the Union back to have time for mourning. And this is widely seen as one of his greatest speeches. There's a line from it I really want you guys to know. He says, "We will never forget them, nor the last time we saw them. This morning, as they prepared for the journey and waved goodbye and slipped the surly bonds of the earth to touch the face of God." He has this really touching tribute that he gives to the Challenger crew members. And in the modern era, oh, sorry, I thought I had one more picture, but I guess I don't. And in the modern era, every January, NASA does a day of remembrance that includes everyone that's been lost on a national mission from Apollo 1 all the way through Columbia. And it's not necessarily on the 28th, it changes year to year, but it is every single year. And I put in the chat, if you guys scroll up, a video of the Day of Remembrance from this year, so you guys can get a feel for that. And I'll hand it back to Dr. Northrup.
Hey, so one thing I just want to talk about now as we're kind of wrapping up is the thing about indelible memories. And these are these memories that make a really big impact on people. And this is collectively one of them in the United States. And I'm sure if you all just sit right now and close your eyes, you'll remember some of those for yourself. If I ask my grandma, she can remember exactly where she was hearing about the assassination of JFK. Many people, perhaps it was the moon landing or the fall of the Berlin Wall. For my generation, of course, it's 9/11. Also, for many people, we talked about this in some other webinars too, like the Columbine shooting. And you kind of ask ourselves, what is that memory? How do we remember it? And I think that a lot of the things came together for this, the witnessing live, whether or not you were watching it on TV. I remember my own father talking about hearing on the radio and pulling over because he was so upset about hearing about it, and that people were kind of like talking with each other about it. It was one of those moments that everyone is mentioning this because of this kind of traumatic collective event that happens. And so this is this humanity of disaster and how we remember these events. And I think that one of the reasons, of course, is because of the teacher and in the flight, right? This was someone super relatable, really just like Misty said, such a charming person, and someone that everyone was just incredibly upset to have imagined being part of this, something that was supposed to be just so wonderful to become such a sad disaster there. And I want us all to think about, like, what do we think moving forward? Like, what will these other things be in our lives? What will those moments be that we are going to witness, that we are going to share, that we are going to tell perhaps our kids and our grandchildren about, like, where we were on those days, what we did, what we witnessed. And this is my moment too, where I want to share, like, encourage you all, if you have older people in your life, ask them where they were on these moments. They would love to share this with you. Write it down, record it on your phone in a voice memo, and so that you can have that and remember those things and these indelible memories that everybody has in their life. And so we're just so excited that you were here today. And I think maybe we have a couple minutes for Q&A. I'm also going to be posting the link in the chat for the attendance for today.
Okay, I see in the chat there was a question. I think several questions have been posted here. One of them was basically, was the Challenger the beginning of the end of the shuttle program? And maybe. Shuttle program was already having some issues prior to that because it was nowhere near as cost effective as it was made out to be. So I think the beginning of the end may have already started prior to the Challenger, but the Challenger accident was basically okay, so we're done. Okay, so that means they did build one more shuttle to sort of replace the Challenger, but they did massively cut back on space shuttle missions. You know, the previous year we had 9 missions. The idea was try to get up to 50. They never opened the Vandenberg as a launch facility. They abandoned that, and after this, we never had even close to 9 missions per year. And so I think that what happened was that the shuttle became what it was originally designed to be, and that was a shuttle to low Earth orbit carrying chunks of the space station up there, servicing the space station, carrying supply to the space station, and then finally they decommissioned the shuttles, quit flying shuttles, and started using unmanned, or rather using other rockets other than shuttles. Ironically, SpaceX, rockets are partially reusable, large portions of them, and they've actually have been able to cut the costs substantially from even the shuttle missions. So yeah, I think eventually the Challenger is what kind of made them say, okay, we're going to abandon the shuttles as soon as we can feasibly do so.
All right. Yeah, I'm seeing in this chat here, Eric Walker from Connect, for my generation, the Challenger seared into the memory like the Kennedy assassination. Yes, I think that that's absolutely right. And I encourage you all to think about what that meant for you and what were these moments for yourself as well. On the screen right now, you'll see if you are interested in joining History Club, you can scan that and fill an interest form. There is in the chat the attendance for today. And I'm going to quickly go over some of the events that are coming up in the next few weeks that I encourage you to attend and sign up for. Many are in the Learn Center. If you're faculty or staff, if you're students, please sign up and ask those professors for your extra credit. This Friday, Dr. Jennifer Bridges is going to be doing a talk about Death by Lightning, which is a TV show on Netflix, and we're going to talk about fact or fiction in that. We also have an in-person, and it's hybrid. It'll be both in-person and online K-pop Demon Hunters on February 19, 2026, coming up in a few weeks. Very excited about that. And then in March, we have American Girl at 40, telling girls' history and shaping women's memory. So sign up for these. If you need the links, please email me. I'm happy to give them all to you as well. And definitely also sign up for our history club if you'd like to join. And one final question, I guess for Misty or Ray here. Do you think NASA will finally make it back to the moon in 2028 with the Artemis project? Great way to kind of wrap up. What is the future now of this?
I am so excited to see what happens with Artemis. We have a lot kind of going on with that, especially the addition of female crew members there. It's going to be really excited. I took my daughters to the NASA space station in Houston over Christmas break, and I got them both T-shirts that have the Artemis logo on them. So we're excited in our house to see what's going on with that.
Yeah, the Artemis is they've already rolled out the launch vehicle to the launch pad, and there's a window of opportunity opening up here starting February 6th. So that will go to the moon for Artemis 2. It'll orbit the moon and then come back. It's not going to land, but that will be the first time anyone's even been to the moon since 1972 with the Apollo 17 mission. One of the first times we went to the moon manned missions was Apollo 8, which also went and orbited and came back. And that was in December of 1968. But this will be the next time back. As far as landing, I am less certain that we are actually going to land according to schedule, because in order to land, you have to have a lander. And at present, NASA is not building their own lander. They're contracting out to build the lander, and it has not yet been built. And so I am a little bit leery about us actually making the Artemis 3 deadline. even Artemis 2, if anything goes wrong between now and then it's likely not to launch, in early February, but it could launch. There's another launch window that's going to be in March, another launch window in April. If you don't launch at the right time, you can't get there, so you have to launch at just the right time, and there's a several day window each month to launch.
Well, thank you so much. We have 5 minutes left in this meeting, so we are right on time. Thank you, everyone who joined us here today. Please put in that attendance form that if you might just scroll up the chat, I can put it back in the chat again. Please put down events that you would like to see. We are very much looking forward to delving into all kinds of different history and all kinds of different subjects and hosting you all again another time. Thank you again and have a great day. Stay warm and safe, and hopefully we will see you all again soon. Bye for now.